Beneath Southern California right now, according to a study published just weeks ago in the Journal of Geophysical Research, two of the region's most dangerous faults are carrying more accumulated stress than at any point in the past 1,000 years. That's not a clickbait exaggeration. It's the actual peer-reviewed finding from a team of seismologists who spent years reconstructing exactly how much pressure has been quietly building beneath the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto faults. And it's exactly the kind of study that earns the description, "Your worst fear confirmed," not because it tells us an earthquake is happening tomorrow, but because it answers a question scientists have been chasing for decades with considerably more precision than we've ever had before. So let's actually walk through what this new model found, what a place called Cajon Pass has to do with any of it, and what this genuinely means and doesn't mean for anyone living in Southern California right now. Let's start with exactly who did this research and how they actually measured something as seemingly invisible as accumulated fault stress. The study was led by Liliane Burkhardt, working alongside co-authors, including Kate Scherer, a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and their team set out to reconstruct centuries of stress accumulation along the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems, two of the most significant, most closely watched fault lines running through the densely populated stretch of Southern California surrounding Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and Riverside. Reconstructing that kind of long-term stress history isn't something you can measure directly with a single instrument. It requires painstaking geological detective work, examining offset geological features, previous rupture patterns preserved in the rock and soil, and detailed slip rate data collected across decades of prior field work, all fed into sophisticated stress modeling techniques that let researchers estimate how much mechanical pressure has been quietly accumulating along specific fault segments since their last major rupture. This kind of research builds directly on decades of prior work by California seismologists, since understanding a single fault stress history requires piecing together evidence from trenching studies, where researchers physically dig across a fault line and examine the layered soil record for signs of past ruptures, combined with modern GPS monitoring, data tracking exactly how much the ground on either side of a fault is currently creeping or remaining locked, and historical earthquake catalogs stretching back as far as written and geological records allow. What that reconstruction revealed is genuinely striking. Both faults are currently under more stress than researchers have been able to document at any point across the entire 1,000-year window their study covered, a genuinely unprecedented finding in terms of the sheer length of the historical baseline researchers were able to establish with this level of confidence, published in a peer-reviewed journal specifically because that kind of 1,000-year baseline represents a meaningful advance over shorter, less comprehensive stress reconstructions that earlier generations of California seismic hazard research had to rely on. Here's where the story gets specifically more concerning than a simple single-fault stress reading would be on its own. Because Burkhardt's team didn't just measure stress on each fault independently, they specifically studied how these two fault systems interact with each other at a critical junction point called Cajon Pass, a mountain pass sitting northeast of Los Angeles near San Bernardino, threading between the San Bernardino Mountains and the San Gabriel Mountains. Cajon Pass isn't just a geographic landmark, it's the specific physical location where the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems meet. And Burkhardt's team described this junction using a genuinely useful metaphor, an earthquake gate, a junction that either stops or transmits large ruptures between the two fault systems, depending on the specific stress conditions present at the time. This kind of fault junction behavior isn't unique to California either. Seismologists studying major fault systems around the world have documented similar gate-like junctions elsewhere, locations where the geometry and stress state of intersecting faults determines whether a rupture beginning on one fault stays contained or jumps across to a neighboring system. And in several well-documented historical cases internationally, exactly this kind of multi-fault jump has produced considerably larger, more destructive earthquakes than either fault alone would have been capable of generating independently. What determines whether that gate stays shut, containing a rupture to just one fault, or swings open, allowing a rupture to jump across and involve both fault systems simultaneously, comes down to how closely aligned the stress levels are on each side of that junction. And according to this new model, both faults are currently loaded to remarkably similar levels, precisely the condition that raises the odds of the gate opening rather than staying closed during a future rupture. That alignment detail is really the single most important and most specifically new piece of information this study contributes, since simply knowing that two individual faults each carry high stress doesn't necessarily tell you whether they're likely to rupture together. It's specifically the relative balance of stress between them at their shared junction that determines whether the gate metaphor tips toward containment or toward a combined larger event. It's worth pausing here to really understand why a joint rupture scenario represents something genuinely more dangerous than the kind of single-fault earthquake most previous California disaster planning has traditionally centered around. A rupture confined to just the southern San Andreas Fault alone is already capable of producing a genuinely catastrophic earthquake that's been well understood and extensively studied for decades. But a rupture that crosses through the Cajon Pass earthquake gate and involves both the San Andreas and San Jacinto faults simultaneously would be considerably larger, releasing more accumulated energy across a longer combined rupture length, producing correspondingly more destructive shaking across an area that includes some of the most densely populated real estate anywhere in the United States, Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, and the Coachella Valley, all sitting within reach of this specific junction's potential combined rupture zone. That's genuinely the core finding driving headlines calling this study a confirmation of California's worst fear, not simply that a big earthquake remains possible, something seismologists have said for generations, but that the specific stress conditions capable of linking two major fault systems into one considerably larger, more destructive event are now measurably, scientifically present in a way researchers haven't been able to document with this level of confidence before. Now, it's genuinely important to be precise about what this study does and does not claim, because that distinction is exactly where a headline can either inform you accurately or mislead you badly. Kate Scherer, the USGS co-author on this research, has been explicit and direct on this point. The study does not predict when a quake will strike. This is a stress assessment, not a forecast with a specific date attached to it. And seismologists studying this exact question have been consistent for years that earthquake timing prediction, in the sense of naming a specific day, month, or even year an earthquake will occur, remains fundamentally impossible with current science, and may always remain so, given how chaotic and locally variable the final trigger mechanism for any individual earthquake actually is. This isn't a new limitation specific to this particular study either. It reflects a decades-old, well-established scientific consensus. Seismologists have pursued genuine earthquake prediction as a research goal for generations, and the field has consistently found that while long-term probability estimates built around stress accumulation, historical recurrence intervals, and fault behavior patterns can be genuinely useful and increasingly precise, the actual final moment when accumulated stress finally exceeds a fault's frictional strength and triggers. Rupture appears to involve enough small scale, essentially unpredictable variability that pinpointing an exact date remains firmly beyond current scientific capability, a limitation that applies just as much to this new Cajon Pass study as it does to every earthquake stress model that's come before it. What this study genuinely does establish is a probability context, a scientifically measured, historically unprecedented level of accumulated stress that makes a major rupture along this specific junction, more likely within any given stretch of time than it would be under lower stress conditions. Exactly the kind of information that shapes emergency planning, building code enforcement, and infrastructure investment decisions without ever claiming to know the actual date a rupture will occur. That's a genuinely important, if less dramatic sounding distinction. This study sharpens the probability estimate considerably, without ever crossing into the kind of specific predictive claim that would actually be scientifically unsupportable given the current state of earthquake research. To understand why this particular stretch of fault has been quietly building toward this point for so long, it helps to know the specific historical backstory researchers are working from. The pressure currently measured along the southern San Andreas has been gradually accumulating since the last truly major rupture along this specific segment, the 1857 Fort Tejon earthquake, an event estimated at roughly magnitude 7.9, that ruptured a stretch of the fault running through a sparsely populated region of California at the time, meaning the enormous population growth Southern California has experienced since then has all occurred during the same multi-generational window. This fault has been silently reloading with stress. Kate Scherer specifically framed the reasoning behind this study's core finding in genuinely accessible terms, explaining that because it's been quite a long time since the southern San Andreas or the San Jacinto have had a large earthquake, the region has accumulated a lot of stress, a fairly intuitive way of understanding exactly why researchers would expect stress levels to be running unusually high after such an extended quiet period along a fault system that historically doesn't stay quiet indefinitely. It's worth putting some actual numbers behind what a major rupture along this stretch of fault would genuinely mean for the people living above it, since abstract stress measurements only tell part of the story. Back in 2008, seismologists led by Dr. Lucy Jones, a Caltech seismologist who's spent decades studying exactly this kind of scenario, developed a detailed simulation specifically modeling a magnitude 7.8 rupture along the southern San Andreas Fault, producing an estimated nearly 2 full minutes of sustained ground shaking across the affected region, a genuinely extraordinary duration compared to the more typical, considerably shorter, shaking most people experience during smaller, more common earthquakes. That simulation, still widely referenced today as the shakeout scenario, projected hundreds of deaths and billions of dollars in damage across Southern California from a single fault rupture alone. along with detailed modeling of exactly how shaking intensity would vary across the region, identifying specific pockets of unusually strong shaking forming away from the fault itself in areas where soft sediment traps and amplifies seismic waves, particularly in the San Gabriel Valley and East Los Angeles, illustrating just how much local geology, not just distance from the fault, shapes exactly where the most severe damage during a major earthquake actually ends up concentrated. The shakeout scenario report also modeled the kind of infrastructure cascade a major rupture would trigger beyond the immediate structural damage. Water and gas pipelines crossing the fault line snapping simultaneously across dozens of points. Transportation corridors connecting Southern California to the rest of the state, severed at multiple locations at once. And emergency responders, facing an overwhelming simultaneous surge of calls for help, spread across an enormous geographic area rather than the more localized, contained damage zone. Emergency services are typically built around handling. And this new study's finding that a rupture could potentially extend beyond just the San Andreas and pull the San Jacinto fault into the same event through the Cajon Pass earthquake gate raises the genuine possibility of an even larger, more destructive version of that same basic scenario, an event capable of exceeding even those already sobering original projections. There's also a genuinely practical, immediate consequence worth understanding that goes beyond the dramatic structural damage most people picture first when they think about a major earthquake. The region's modern infrastructure dependency creates its own distinct vulnerability. According to reporting on this same research, a major rupture along this fault system could knock out electricity and internet access for millions of Southern Californians in less than 2 minutes, essentially the exact duration of the shaking itself. A genuinely sobering illustration of just how quickly modern interconnected infrastructure can fail even before the shaking itself has fully stopped, and how dependent an enormous, densely populated region has become on electrical and communications infrastructure that wasn't necessarily designed with this specific kind of simultaneous, widespread disruption fully in mind. So, given all of this genuinely serious, scientifically grounded risk, is there any reassuring context worth including here? Or does this study simply confirm an unavoidable catastrophe waiting to happen? The honest answer includes real, substantive reasons for tempered confidence alongside the genuine concern. Modern building codes throughout California have been extensively revised and strengthened over the decades, specifically in response to lessons learned from past major earthquakes, meaning cities today should withstand strong shaking considerably better than structures did during California's last truly catastrophic urban earthquake, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, an event that struck a region with dramatically less seismically engineered infrastructure than exists throughout Southern California today. Modern seismic building codes throughout the state now require new construction to meet rigorous standards, specifically designed around the kind of ground motion a major San Andreas rupture would produce, incorporating decades of accumulated engineering research into exactly how buildings, bridges, and other critical infrastructure actually behave under severe, sustained shaking, along with mandatory retrofit requirements that have already brought many of the state's most vulnerable older structures, including unreinforced masonry buildings and vulnerable soft-story apartment complexes, up to considerably safer modern standards over the past several decades. That said, researchers and disaster planners have been careful and honest about the limits of that reassurance too. A joint rupture crossing through the Cajon Pass earthquake gate, and involving both major fault systems simultaneously, could still prove genuinely catastrophic, even accounting for decades of building code improvements, since the sheer scale and duration of shaking involved in a combined multi-fault rupture would test even California's considerably more earthquake-resistant modern infrastructure in ways smaller, more routine earthquakes simply don't. It's genuinely useful context that international comparisons offer here too, the 2023 earthquakes that struck Turkey, registering magnitude 7, 3, and 7. 8 killed more than 53,000 people, a genuinely devastating toll that stemmed significantly from widespread building code violations and inadequately enforced construction standards throughout the affected region. A stark, sobering illustration of just how much genuine difference rigorous building code enforcement actually makes in determining a major earthquake's ultimate human cost, and a large part of why California's own considerably more consistent code. Enforcement genuinely matters for how this state's next major earthquake likely compares in terms of casualties, even accounting for a comparably sized or even larger rupture. It's also worth understanding that this specific study fits within a broader, genuinely active moment in West Coast earthquake research, with multiple significant findings emerging just within the past several months that are collectively reshaping how seismologists think about California's earthquake risk. A separate study published earlier this year found evidence suggesting the Cascadia subduction zone, the massive fault system running along the Pacific Northwest coastline, and the San Andreas fault might be more mechanically connected than scientists previously assumed, raising the possibility that a major Cascadia earthquake could help trigger a subsequent San Andreas rupture. A genuinely striking finding that emerged from unusual sediment layers discovered during an offshore drilling expedition. Patterns suggesting both fault systems may have ruptured close together in the past more often than researchers had previously recognized. One researcher involved in that separate Cascadia-focused study offered a genuinely blunt assessment of the stakes involved, noting it's kind of hard to exaggerate what a magnitude 9 earthquake would actually be like in the Pacific Northwest, and the same research specifically raised concerns about a potential coast-wide earthquake sequence. A chain reaction scenario that could impact nearly the entire U.S. West Coast within a matter of hours, rather than the more contained single-region events most previous disaster planning has traditionally modeled independently for each specific fault system. Separately, researchers studying the geology beneath Northern California have been tracking swarms of tiny, otherwise imperceptible earthquakes to map out a surprisingly complex fault structure hidden beneath the region, work that's continuing to refine scientists' understanding of exactly how California's various fault systems interact with one another at a level of detail that simply wasn't possible with the technology and data available even a decade ago. None of these separate studies mechanically confirm or depend on one another. They represent parallel, independent lines of research all converging on a similar, broader theme. California's earthquake risk is measurably more interconnected and, in some specific, well-documented respects, more elevated than earlier generations of seismic hazard models fully captured, precisely the kind of genuine scientific progress that happens when new data, collection techniques, and more sophisticated modeling tools become available to researchers studying a genuinely difficult, decades-old scientific question. So what should someone actually do with this information if panicking over an unpredictable timeline isn't a productive response? This is exactly the kind of study that should translate into renewed practical earthquake preparedness rather than anxiety over an unknowable date. Kate Scherer herself has pointed people specifically toward resources from the Earthquake Country Alliance, an organization specifically dedicated to helping California residents actually prepare for the earthquakes seismologists agree are coming, even without being able to specify exactly when. Dr. Lucy Jones has emphasized the same basic, practical guidance that's remained consistent across decades of earthquake safety research. Taking immediate protective action during actual shaking genuinely saves lives, specifically recommending the well-established drop, cover, and hold on technique, getting under a sturdy table or piece of furniture immediately when shaking begins, since even just a few seconds of that kind of protective action can mean the difference between walking away from a collapsed structure and being trapped or seriously injured underneath one. Beyond that immediate, in-the-moment response, genuine household earthquake preparedness includes securing heavy furniture and appliances that could tip over during severe shaking, identifying safe spots in every room of a home or workplace well before an actual earthquake occurs, keeping a stocked emergency supply kit with water, food, and any necessary medications easily accessible, and establishing a family communication plan for reconnecting with loved ones if phone networks become overloaded or damaged in the aftermath of a major event. Precisely the kind of practical, actionable steps that translate a genuinely alarming scientific finding into something an individual household can actually do something about. The annual Great California Shakeout, organized specifically to help raise public awareness and encourage actual household and workplace earthquake preparedness, remains one of the most accessible, genuinely useful ways for residents to actively engage with exactly this kind of risk in a structured, practical way, rather than simply absorbing another alarming headline and moving on without taking any concrete action. It's worth closing on the same note Kate Scherer herself used when discussing this study's genuine implications. We should certainly expect to experience large earthquakes in our lifetimes. That's not a new or newly alarming statement. Seismologists have been saying some version of the same basic message about Southern California for generations, but this new stress model gives that long-standing expectation a considerably more precise, scientifically grounded foundation than researchers have had before. A 1,000-year historical baseline confirming that current stress conditions along 2 of the region's most significant faults, and specifically at the critical junction connecting them, are genuinely unprecedented within that entire documented window. That's the actual complete story behind this headline, not a prediction of exactly when the next major Southern California earthquake will strike, since that remains genuinely unknowable with current science, but a meaningfully improved, more precise understanding of just how primed the underlying system currently is, information that translates directly into better emergency planning, more informed building code enforcement, and a renewed, evidence-based reason for anyone living in the affected region. to make sure their own household earthquake preparedness is genuinely up to date, rather than something to think about only after the next headline like this one appears.